In chapter 27, what we're going to do is take the grammar that you learned in chapter 26, and we're going to learn how it applies to a subsection, one specific kind of participle. Participles break into two basic categories, either adjectival or adverbial. You would expect that from a verbal adjective, right? Their form doesn't vary. I mean, if you see erchomenos, that doesn't tell you whether it's adjectival or adverbial. But in terms of how the participles function and what they mean in context, you can break them into two basic categories. And if the participle is adverbial, it means that its primary meaning is helping you to understand something about the verb. If the participle is functioning adjectivally, it tells you that the participle is primarily telling you something about another noun, for example. So participles break into two basic camps, adverbial, adjectival. They're identical in form. We have to learn when they are functioning adverbially or when they're functioning adjectively, and then how you translate those two different kinds of participles. Okay? In chapter 27, we are going to learn present adverbial participles. In other words, we're only dealing with participles built on the present tense stem, which means they're always going to be what aspect? They're always going to be continuous. Now, how do I know that? Well, because I didn't put any other participles in your exercises. Okay? So for right now, they're all present. Second of all of these participles are adverbial. We're actually not going to hit the adjectival participles for another 2 chapters. So for right now, just understand all the participles we're going to look at are going to be categorized as adverbials, which means the primary meaning is going to be in modifying the verb and not some other word. Okay? So present adverbial participles. They modify verbs, and yet, and here's the kind of the odd part again about participles. Let's say that you have a subject, and let's say it's feminine plural, and then you have the verb, and then you have an adverbial participle, and then let's say you have a direct object that's masculine plural. What's going to determine the case number and gender of the participle? Even the adverbial participle. Well, grammatically, it still has to modify a noun, right? It's a verbal adjective. The thrust of its meaning may be directed against the verb, but if it's the subject who's doing the participle will be feminine plural. If it's the direct object, the participle will be masculine plural. In other words, even if you have an adverbial participle, it still has to agree with a noun to get its case number and gender, even if the force of the verb, force of the meaning is directed against the verb. Now, what you're going to find is that the majority of adverbial participles are, guess what case? Most of them are going to be nominative. Because normally when you're modifying the verb as a participle, it's the subject of the verb who's also doing the participle. So most adverbial participles are nominative, but not necessarily all. Okay? So adverbial participles modify the verb in terms of meaning. While eating, she walked into the room. So the author wants to tell you something about the walked, telling you something else about what happened when she walked. Well, what was happening? She was eating. Okay? The thrust of the participle is directed against the verb, but it's still going to agree with some noun to get its case number and gender. The big clue, when you're just reading the New Testament and you come across a participle, is if it's anarthrous. What does that mean? Okay, if it is not immediately preceded by the definite article, it is probably adverbial. Let me say it a different way. All adverbial participles must be anarthrous. All right? All adverbial participles must be anarthrous. It's impossible to have an adverbial participle with an article. Impossible. Okay? As we go through these chapters, there are certain charts that are absolutely critical for you to learn. This is the chart that is critical to learn for each of the participles. And what the chart does is tells you how Greek puts together the different participles. So how do you form the present, or what I prefer to call the continuous, participle? Well, you start with the present tense stem, but you already know that. You add a connecting vowel. You already know that. You put on the appropriate participle morpheme, and then you have case endings, right? So on pistuon test, you have the verb pistuo. There's your connecting vowel. There's your nutal participle morpheme and the case ending. Now in the feminine, the omicron is actually the connecting vowel that's been merged. And so when you go into the feminine, it's a little different. You don't have a separate connecting vowel. But you see how to form the present participle. Take the present tense stem, and in some cases you add a connecting vowel. You have your morpheme and the case endings. That's how you form the present participle. Okay? This also is what we've already seen, right, in chapter 26. What morphemes are going to be used for the present participle? Well, if it's an active, it's masculine and neuter, we'll use nutal. The feminine will use usa. If it's a middle passive, it'll be men with the appropriate vowel. Mena, if it's masculine or neuter. Mene, if it's feminine. But you already know that, right? Okay, let me break the present participle into its two halves. And let's look first at the active. Those are the forms we've already seen. Pistuon test. You just use an active participle morpheme. So what does it actually look like? You ready to see what participles really look like? There is the singular form of the present active participle. Skip down to the genitive at first. Luontos, luonti, luonta. Just like pos, right? Flip over to the neuter. Luon, luontos, luonti, luon. Just like pos, right? What's happened in the nominative and accusative singular to the case endings? Well, what happens in pos? There's no case ending. Final towels drop, rule 8, and you get luon. In the feminine, it's absolutely regular. Notice there's an alpha eta shift, right? Luusa, luuses, luuse, luusan. Do you see how it's going together? It's the luon is the only one that's weird. But we've seen this before. No case ending, the tau drops off, and the omicron lengthens to omega. Okay, that's the only one that you have to be especially careful of, because the only time you've seen omega nu elsewhere is where? All right, genitive plural. Okay, now there is another place now where omega nu occurs. And it's the nominative singular masculine of participles. Plural's real easy, isn't it? Everything is as you would expect it. But in the masculine and the neuter, because of third declension, the nu tau drop out before the case ending sigma iota, and the vowel lengthens to omicron upsilon from omicron to compensate for the loss. What does that look like? Looks like a third person plural indicative, doesn't it? You'd be surprised how hard it is to confuse the dative plural participles from third person plural present indicatives. You would look at it and say, oh, we're so confused. Actually, it's not. That when you're reading it in context, it's very simple to see these things. But you need to be aware that that's where the similarity is going to be. In terms of memory work, here's what's important. You need to know the grammar of chapter 26. You need to know how the different participles are put together. But the key to memorizing the forms, after you've done that, is to memorize the nominative and genitive singular, all three genders. This is what I will be requesting on tests and quizzes. I'll say, give me the 6 forms for, and I'll say present active and aorist middle participle, that kind of stuff. So what you need to be able to memorize is on, usa, on tos, uses, on tos. If you memorize those 6 forms, then the rest of the paradigm flows. Now, if you struggle with dative plurals, you may want to scribble them in as well. But in terms of what you need to memorize, this is the key. So the next 4 chapters have the chart of how you put a participle together, have the participle, and then have those 6 forms. But these are the forms that are so important to memorize. Make sure you know how the words are being put together, how the participles are being put together, and then know these 6 forms, okay? What are the 6 forms for the present middle passive? Piece of cake. Amanas, amane, amanan, amanu, amanes, amanu. No big deal, right? As long as you know your nouns, you're just fine. How do you translate these things? Well, the challenge in participles is that you have to look at about 3 or 4 things and then ask yourself, okay, how do I say that in English? You know, it used to be you say anthropos, you go, man. But with participles, you have to look at about 3 or 4 different things, kind of hold them together, and then say, okay, how do I say this? So the first thing you have to do is look at aspect. Well, it's easy. They're all going to be continuous. Okay, you probably aren't going to be able to bring it into English nicely, but it's probably best initially to write in worse English, but make it clear that you know that it's continuous. And you can use the word continual or something. But you have aspect, then you have to look at voice. Is it active, middle, or passive or deponent? Then you have to look at what the word means. Okay? Then the simple thing is simply to stick ing onto it. Eating, she walked into the room. Now what you're going to find is that with adverbial participles, sometimes you can turn them into temporal clauses, and you can add the word while. Sometimes they're indicating cause, and you can put the word because. He woke up ringing. He woke up because of the ringing. In other words, what you're going to have are certain verses where, yeah, you can translate it with the ing, but it's kind of weird. You can put while or because, and as you get into Greek, you'll find there's a lot more keywords that can be used. If it fits the context, if it makes good sense, if it makes a better flow of English, you can put them in. That's part of the interpretation aspect of Greek.